How are you this morning? Welcome to Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and my name is Bhoe Tiwari. You are watching MCTV, Multicultural TV, and you are listening on U97.5, Hot Like Pepper Radio, Multicultural Radio. We have a good program for you this morning. You just heard the news, and you appreciate now what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, what are the issues that we focus on. But today we're going to have a discussion. We are going to continue our discussion on independence. We are going to reflect on independence itself. We are going to be 59 years old on August the 31st, 2021, which is a few days away. And we are going to be 60 years old in a year. So we're going to reflect on independence. We're going to talk about where we are, and we're going to talk about how we might craft a future against the background of this horrible pandemic that we are all living through. Our guests, we have two very, very vital guests this morning. One is Professor Hamid Ghany. We'll talk to him first. And he is the director of SALISES, the Sir Arthur Lewis, basically research institute at the University of the West Indies. He's in charge of the Trinidad and Tobago unit, and there is one also at Cave Hill and another one at Mona. And our other guest will be Mr. Kevin Baldeusing. Kevin is a journalist and he's a writer. He's written a couple of books, and he's a person who reflects on the society and takes a kind of critical view of the society and its operations. And we will hear from him also what is his thinking. The really important news for every parent who has a school-age child today is that yesterday we heard from the Minister of Education that school is going to reopen on September the 6th, but as virtual schools. That's to say, students will be taught online from September 6th. And the second thing we heard was from the Prime Minister, in which he indicated that the government objective in policy is to get all students back to school, and that while they restart school on September 6th virtually, the objective is, with the vaccination of children proceeding, they will try to get fourth formers, fifth formers, and sixth formers back to school as part of a first phase until the vaccination escalates, the number of children who get vaccinations increase, and they will then try to fully open face-to-face education. So 3 things there we need to remember. September 6th is the opening of school, and all teachers and students can access schooling and continue their education virtually. Second thing, and the Minister of Education mentioned, she also mentioned it here on this program when we had an interview a couple of weeks ago, that they are making every effort to make sure that every child has a device for virtual access. The second thing is that there is going to be a phased return to face-to-face education. So fourth and fifth formers, why? Because they have CXC and they have to prepare. The fifth formers have CXC in a few months, and the fourth formers begin their preparation for CXC after 3 years of basic education in high school, where they choose their subject and the subjects in the fourth form for CXC. And sixth form. Why? Because they are in a 2-year program, basically dealing with higher high school education, which is measured, assessed by CAPE, which has been the replacement for the old A-levels for the Caribbean Examinations Council. So they have their preparations as well. So the phase program will begin with these students face-to-face, and the second program will be to phase in the face-to-face education of every class in every school in collaboration with the success in vaccination and the attainment of vaccination numbers. That is the plan, that is the program. It seems reasonable. However, the one thing we are not sure about is how fast the vaccination process is going to proceed, how it is going to be accelerated, and how many students, also how many teachers, and how we are going to get to the point of face-to-face education for all. This is a challenge. The minister acknowledges this. She said yesterday that she understands the controversies that are raging. She understands the different points of view that are raging everywhere, that are being expressed everywhere. And she understands that it's a controversial issue. But, I mean, we have to get our children back to school. Schooling online is great, and the time may well come, given the technological innovations that are taking place, that the whole business of schooling is going to change altogether. So that, I mean, you may end up with a situation in which there are only examinations of measurements which assess where you have reached in certain areas of knowledge, and you would then be able to determine how are you going to get there. So you might be able to do it on your own, you'll be able to do it through private tutelage, through group work, online, through online education, through your own initiative, or there might be some adaptation of schools and how they function. All of that may come into the future. Right now, though, we have an immediate task, which is that the children have been out of school for a long, long time. Young people up to the age of 18 in both primary school and secondary school, and that includes as well preschool. They have been out of school, and now that they've been out of school for so long, there is a learning loss. This has been acknowledged by the head of tutor. It has been acknowledged by the Minister of Education. And I think anybody who is serious about education, or any parent looking at their children, would recognize that the transition to online education has not been perfect, and there have been technical and technological hitches, and that there have been some, what can I say, some difficulties in making sure that the children achieve the amount of work that they would normally do in the classroom. So I think that is an issue. So there's the issue of learning loss as well as educational progress. And in the immediate situation of dealing with the fourth and fifth forms and the sixth forms, you have the reality of examinations to deal with. And as you know, the system is based on progress from examination to examination. So these things are very, very important in the life of a student and in the progress of a student to adulthood and to opportunities and careers in the future. So education then is the big focus this morning, and with education, vaccination, and in education, the combination possible between online education and face-to-face education, and how we are going to manage going forward. Okay, we will examine those issues again because they will come up from time to time. And we want to welcome now Professor Hamid Ghany, who is Head Director of SALISES at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine. Dr. Ghany has been a Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. He has been head of department before. He is a political scientist, and he specializes in constitutional matters as well as parliamentary matters. And we will have a discussion with him this morning, and we hope that you will be part of it. So please stay. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe. I am Bhoe, and we ask Professor Ghany to please come on now.
Well, good morning.
Professor Ghany, how are you? Can you hear?
Very well, thanks. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again. Glad to have you on now. We had a short discussion last time because on the day that you were coming on, the Prime Minister was also a guest, and that discussion was extended. So we had a short discussion, but we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we want to talk about independence. And, you know, I had two guests yesterday, very, very alert and creative, insightful people. You know both of them. One was Mr. Mangal Patesar, who is a sitarist and musician and musical composer. And the other one was Jerry Besso, who you know has written on Trinidad and Tobago and its evolution, but he is also a publisher, and he's very alert on intellectual currents in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. And I think of all the people in Trinidad and Tobago, he has probably, through Paria Publishing, published the most books on the subject of Trinidad and Tobago in a variety of areas. So we talk with him. And let me start with Mangal first. Mangal said that when independence came, he was about 16 years old. And he remembered, when he looks back now, he remembers that the thought in his mind at the time was that the big task for Trinidad and Tobago as an independent country, even at that tender age of 16, was the task of achieving social cohesion. I won't color that in any way. I will just ask you if you would speak to that concept in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. How have we done in terms of that? Are we doing okay? Are there challenges perhaps that we have now that we need to address? Is that still a burning issue in the life and future of Trinidad and Tobago, given that we are now 59 years old?
Well, thank you both for having me on this morning. And to get right into the subject that you have raised, I think that one of the things we need to be cognizant of is the issue of the same social cohesion you're talking about. That at independence, we have to appreciate that just the year before, we were supposed to be getting ready to become part of something called the West Indies. We were going to be one of 10 territories in this region that were going to be part of a federation of the West Indies.
Yes.
And certain developments took place in the course of 1961 that opened the door in 1962 to us becoming a nation state on our own, as opposed to being one of 10 territories in a federation of the West Indies. So that we have to appreciate the backdrop of independence against the collapse of the West Indian Federation. So that from a social cohesion standpoint, we move from becoming citizens of something called the West Indies to becoming citizens of Trinidad and Tobago as an independent country. So that the Jamaican referendum on the 19th of September 1961, Jamaica was afforded the opportunity, its electorate was afforded the opportunity to have a say by virtue of exercising their own right to self-determination to determine whether they wished to become an independent state inside of a federation of 10, or whether they wished to secede from the federation and go their own way and become an independent country on their own. There was a narrow majority of about 54% that voted in favor of Jamaica withdrawing from the federation. That was September of 61. So that right away, the situation became very different. The federal government of the West Indies went into negotiation mode to negotiate with Trinidad and Tobago, who was the second largest country in the federation at the time, to see if a federation of 9 could be constructed. And we therefore saw that, we saw Arthur Lewis, but he was Arthur Lewis at the time. He was the chief negotiator for the federal government and had interactions with Eric Williams and with the other leaders of the members of what would have been the federation that remained at that time. And it turned out that they had come to some kind of understanding as to how they might go forward. But in January of 1962, the People's National Movement General Council passed a resolution calling on Trinidad and Tobago to withdraw from the federation and to proceed to independence on its own. But the pace picked up immediately. So from that moment on, the government accepted the resolution of the ruling party. And then by February of 1962, there was a draft constitution for an independent Trinidad and Tobago. No public consultation and all of these other things that we've become accustomed to. A draft appeared by February 19th of 1962 and was serialized in the Trinidad Guardian over 3 days. And then by March of 62, you had invitations to the commentators on the Constitution, those who sent in their comments, to assemble at a Queen's Hall conference in April of 62. So April 25th to 27th of 1962, there was a conference at Queen's Hall on the draft constitution. This is a draft that had been prepared by Ellis Clark and put out for public consultation. By May of 62, a joint select committee of both houses reviewed a revised draft. And by the 28th of May to the 8th of June, we were at a constitutional conference at Marlborough House in London. And by August 31st, 1962, we became independent. So the federation had been dissolved by the end of May. So that it was a mad rush, a mad scramble to move from becoming citizens of something called the West Indies to becoming citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The whole patriotism argument just had to immediately flip on its head. And we were a nation state in very short order. So I think that we have to look at the whole social cohesion bit in the context of how we move from becoming citizens of something called the West Indies to becoming citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, and then seeking to build a nation state on that basis. And I think that it's a very interesting history. It's perhaps record time for becoming an independent nation state, coming out of a regional enterprise to becoming a citizen of a nation state as opposed to a citizen of a federation that would have had 10 countries. That will have an impact on the social cohesion argument.
Yeah, when you look at the current situation, there's a lot of passionate nationalism, for instance, in Jamaica. One feels it. I mean, like you, I've been to Jamaica many times. And in Jamaica, there is a strong sense of Jamaican nationalism, notwithstanding all the fractures and fissions that you have in that society. And the passion of being Jamaican is there. In Trinidad and Tobago, you have a lot of patriotic feeling. People feel strongly for the country, but that is accompanied by certain tensions and uncertainties about where people fit and how people fit in the society. Do you think that had we had the federation, we would have had this kind of federal West Indian nationalism? I mean, we had the cricket team, but I am not sure how much else we had beyond that. And do you think that we have done a good job in Trinidad and Tobago of moving so quickly from federation to nationhood to build or to put together the building blocks of social cohesion so necessary for a successful society? I mean, have we done that?
Well, I think the society has remained cohesive in terms of the foundations. We haven't had the kind of fractures that we see in other traditional societies. It's a largely immigrant society. The issue of belonging and the sense of belonging is something that certainly does exist. I think the competitive force is the political arena, where you have these cycles of divisiveness. Because if you map a Venn diagram over the voting behavior, you see the differences in stark reality. But there have been occasions in our political history when the population has in fact voted in a manner that would defy those who want to argue otherwise. So that I think that the issue of social cohesion has been challenged by the political arena. So we cannot escape that. But the reality is that the constitutional framework that was established at independence is designed to promote divisiveness. And we have a constitutional arrangement that depends on a majoritarian model and as opposed to a consensus model. There are many other types of constitutional arrangements, but the one that we use is one where there must be division. There has to be division. There has to be a government and there has to be an opposition. And when you map that over the society in terms of political outcomes, voting behavior, and other realities, you end up having a framework that is designed to promote division. So that if you criticize and you offer an alternative view, that gets confused at times with the viewpoint that you want to undermine the state. And an unfortunate trend has developed in more recent times that if you are criticizing the government, you have become unpatriotic. That, I think, is an unfortunate development. That's a trend we need to pull back from because you cannot be operating a political system in which it is mandatory that you have an opposition to the government, and that when that opposition seeks to perform its functions and criticizes the government, it becomes unpatriotic. The fortunate thing for us is that there has been a swing of the pendulum, and that we have had changes of government in 1986, in 1991, in 1995, in 2001, in 2010, and in 2015. So the pendulum has gone back and forth between political parties. The important thing to note, of course, is the length of time that it took before you had any kind of political change. And then mapping on top of all of that has been the issue of the extent to which there has been political cohesion and political divisiveness, unity movements into politics that have become fractured. And I think that, we have to appreciate that the society has done well to remain as a cohesive entity, but we cannot ignore the currents, the political currents that swirl underneath, because the political system demands that we be divided by virtue of a government opposition arrangement. I mean, no opposition is going to perpetually support a government to remain perpetually in opposition. It's not going to happen. The PNM didn't do it when they were in opposition. The UNC is not doing it when they were in opposition. But there are occasions when government and opposition do come together and agree on legislation that requires special majorities, and they all vote for it after negotiation and amendments that have been made. So yes, it can be done, but do not expect an opposition to be a perpetual supporter of a government, because they are expected to oppose. And that is what the system is based on. It's based on that kind of foundation, and we cannot ignore it.
All right. I mean, you raise very, very important and deep issues there. I mean, you are saying that the Constitution facilitates and fosters division. Then that division finds its way into the parliament because of the divisive nature of the political requirements to get into office, and of course the partisan and polarizing nature of political campaigns, which then give you your parliament. I mean, is it fair to say that the Constitution, and we're moving now from the 1962 Constitution of Independence to the Republican Constitution, under which we are now governed. Is it fair to say, though, as you have said, that the Constitution promotes divisiveness? Don't other countries have constitutions which facilitate the emergence of political parties, and you have that same divisiveness there? Is there something else that we need to put in the mix?
Well, I think that the issue that I'm getting at is that the fact that the political system requires that there be a division, it is just a division between government and opposition. But when you drill down on the effect of what that really means and the effect that it has, and you look at voting behavior patterns, and you look at the swings, the system is based on the premise that there will be a rotation of power. And that is how it balances itself, so that there can be a rotation of power from one side to the other. And if you get a rotation of power, then you have a functioning democracy in that sense of the term. In the other systems where you may have a consensus-based model, where you have a different type of electoral system as opposed to the first-past-the-post system, you may have a proportional representation type system where you may not get natural majorities coming forward, and you have to govern on the basis of consensus, that political parties have to form alliances with other political parties in order to govern, and that therefore has its own effect in the political process by promoting some measure of consensus among political parties to keep society stable. The reality is that we have remained stable largely because we have had a certain level of changes of government. We've had at least 6 changes of government. And that means that power has rotated, so that the system is not one that is based on a futility. For the first 30 years of Trinidad and Tobago's politics, and let's say 25 years into independence, there appeared to be a certain futility in the politics where only one party would rule. But after 1986, that changed, and the futility is not there. So that it is a function of leadership and the ability to attract voters who are not all locked into this mythical tribal arrangement that you hear people talk about. Because when you look at some of the swings that have taken place, there is no futility in the politics anymore. There is the potential to rotate. The question is, and we've had a lot of arguments about first past the post and proportional representation and so on. The reality is there is very little energy to make change among the wider population. I mean, you know, a lot of constitutional reform debate goes on among political elites who would like to see certain changes, but when you drill down to the general public, there is not that energy. The energy is not there. The consciousness is not there to be able to effect the kind of political change in the political process that the elites would like to see. And I think that there is that disconnect. In terms of constitutional reform, 1976 was just a reallocation of a couple of things in our constitutional arrangement, but largely a Westminster Whitehall model was retained, and we have kept largely a Westminster Whitehall model. Attempting to make changes to that model can be difficult because you start to encounter a number of vested interests who perhaps are more silent and in the background, who will become very uncomfortable if the current arrangements were to change, because they may lose some of the control that they may have over the process by virtue of their ability to finance campaigns and their ability to influence outcomes and so on. So we have to be very careful about how far we go in terms of the stability of the process. But I think that to a large extent, we have maintained a certain degree of stability. We have managed to have changes of power. The pendulum has managed to swing. But I think that the level of consciousness in the society among the general public about constitutional matters is perhaps not where it could be or should be. And that means, therefore, that if you look at the period of time that we have been independent, during which time we became a republic, there isn't much desire for change, and there really has not been any kind of significant political change that has rearranged the foundation.
In your view, do you think we really need an overhaul of the constitutional apparatus under which we are governed, and why?
Well, I think that some of the outcomes that we have now are such that we really continue to debate about all of these things about the role of an opposition and why are they opposed to these government policies. And so you get that kind of discussion, which betrays the fact that an opposition has a particular role to play in the process. And I think that I'm one of those who has been involved in exercises involving constitutional reform. But what I've come to realize, having been involved in those exercises, is that at the grassroots level, you're not seeing that energy. There is no energy for constitutional change. There is no energy for constitutional reform. And to a large extent, we haven't seen that kind of thing. The People's Partnership attempted some reforms. The PNM had attempted them. Former Prime Minister Patrick Manning had a roundtable before A&R Robinson had tried with the Constitution Commission. You have all kinds of attempts that have been made at having discussions on constitution reform. But really and truly, if you look at the record, not much has happened. And I think that there has been some tinkering around the edges. There have been some changes made here and there. And when we look back at some of the changes, the whole Police Service Commission, Commissioner of Police issue, we've seen the changes that were made in 2006. How effective they have been and how effective that process has been would be something that perhaps we can evaluate over time. And what I'm pointing to is that we have had minimal change in certain selected areas, but no overhaul of the system in a fundamental way to rearrange the foundation of the state. And what I'm saying is that we're not seeing, like, whereas in 1970 you had major uprising and a level of consciousness in the society that was at a particular level, and Eric Williams had to deal with that. And one of his responses was to appoint a Constitution Commission under Sir Hugh Wooding, and we came with the Republican Constitution. But the Republican Constitution is nothing that was fundamental in terms of change. It was more cosmetic because many of the institutions have remained. Some of them may just function a little differently. And the head of state is no longer Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but rather a president that is elected by a parliament that is controlled by a majority. So I think that, yes, to my mind, I think that there is more that can be done, but you cannot embark on making constitutional change without the energy for it coming from below. It has to have some connection back to the wider population, and that is simply not there. You could have public consultations, and I've been involved in chairing some of these public consultations, and you go to some of these public consultations and you get a handful of people who show up, and some of them may be discussing issues that are pertinent to their general daily lives, and people may think that that has nothing to do with the Constitution, but the reality is they are expressing their frustration at the disconnect between the services provided by the state and the impact on their lives. And that, to a large extent, is a reflection of the fact that there is some kind of disconnect between the constitutional arrangements in the formal sense and the filtering down to the lives of people. But the extent to which that has impacted on people wanting to rise up and request change and so on, it's not there. And you're not seeing it. And I think that as long as you don't have that energy for change at the political level, they're not going to push it. Because there has to be that connection between the political elites and the grassroots element and the groundswell for some kind of movement.
Yeah. Well, even in the 1976 Constitution, the Constitution that we ended up with was very different from what was proposed by the Wooding Commission. In fact, the Wooding Commission's report was repudiated in Parliament by the then Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams. And basically, the 1976 Constitution, as you said, was the 1962 Constitution with a few tinkerings here and there and embellishments, but that it really did not change the constitutional order of 1962. And the problem of passion in the population to address the issue of constitutional reform is a more fundamental issue, in the sense that maybe people, is it that people don't see the connection between the structure of power? Because, I mean, that's what a constitution does. It says where power shall lie and how it will be balanced and distributed. Is it that people do not understand the value of this, and they confuse elections and election behavior and parliamentary gains or losses as something having to do with elections, but they don't see the connection between that and the Constitution, which then governs everything that you do in Parliament, in the executive, etc. Is there some missing ingredient? Is there a democratic deficit, you might say, in the population?
Well, I think that the fact that the country has remained largely politically stable has not provided a compelling reason for the mass of the population to rise up and express a desire for political change. I think those who are closer to the system and who work the system among the political class and the political elites, they are much closer to it, and they are able to understand that, look, the way in which power operates here, you know, there could be some benefits derived from making certain changes to the process. But the average person in the street whose life is not disturbed by political instability is not going to be clamoring for any major constitutional change as long as their lives remain relatively stable and that they are able to go about their daily business and accomplish some of what they want to get out of life in terms of their existence, their daily existence. So I don't think it's a situation where you have personal inconvenience. I think that if there was personal inconvenience to a large extent in people's daily lives, we would then be finding a deeper level of agitation for some kind of change. But in the absence of that, and people enjoying relatively comfortable lives in terms of a large middle class that is able to operate in a particular way, you're not going to get that energy for change. And I think that sometimes you may get an attempt by some political movements to try to mobilize people, perhaps who are more disadvantaged in the society, to try to get them to play certain roles. That kind of political manipulation does not necessarily bring about constitutional change. And I think that we need to be very careful about how far we want to tinker with a constitution that people perhaps may find to be comfortable. And when you float different ideas, then of course you're going to get the countervailing views with regard to those ideas, and the element of concern that without political consensus across the aisles between both sides of the political divide in the parliament, as an example, you're not going to get the constitutional change, because the system requires a two-thirds majority in the House, or three-quarters majority in one House and the other House, and two-thirds in the other House. You're not going to get that change. There isn't that political consensus, and therefore you're going to be stalemated unless there are issues that we can agree on by comprehensive negotiations, and you come with something that is going to make a change, and everyone can vote for it, and yes, you do get that change. So that a lot of people look to Parliament and the executive and the courts and so on as places where they will have the outcomes determined. But as long as those things are not in any way violently disrupting their lives, there is no compelling reason for people to want to talk about constitutional change.
But look at political behavior. I'm talking about the collective in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have a two-party system with each party sort of rooted in an ethnic core. Now, each party has evolved a little bit and become a little more diverse, but the core support in an ethnic enclave remains. We've had a situation in which attempts at forming a third party, which is not really rooted in any ethnic enclave, but which tends to attract, you might say, a more diverse, perhaps more middle class interest or following, has emerged, but they have never been successful. And you've had situations in which coalitions of different kinds have formed, as let's say in the NAR of 1986, as let's say the coalition of the ULF, was it the UNC, sorry, and the DAC and then you had the People's Partnership, but those coalitions could not be sustained beyond an election loss. Now, is that a constitutional problem? Because political behavior led to these different options that we can now look back on and analyze. But is that a flaw in the constitutional process? And do we need to transform the system in order to create the conditions where coalition politics is possible. And the other question with that, is coalition politics desirable? Or do we continue with this two-party system based on its location, each one of them, in an ethnic enclave?
Well, once you have strong third parties in a first-past-the-post system, you're going to have skewed outcomes. So you had 1981, 1991, and 2007 examples of strong third parties, and the PNM was able to win with, in the case of 2007, a manufactured majority, that is, win a majority of seats with a minority of votes. In 1991, win a majority of seats with a minority of votes. In 1981, they were able to win a majority of seats with a majority of votes. But the strong third party impacts on the outcome. In 1986 and 2010, you had a different kind of arrangement because the first-past-the-post system was played by the parties who were involved in it. So once you don't have direct contests to create third-party outcomes, you can get a different outcome, which can create a landslide effect, which is what happened in 1986 and 2010. That's a function of the electoral system. That's not necessarily a function of the Constitution. And then you have arrangements such as in 1995, where you had an electoral arrangement which became a post-election coalition and was not necessarily a pre-election coalition in terms of how the parties conducted themselves. And the NAR of 1995 contested the election on the grounds that they wanted to make the difference so that the system can be gamed. I mean, you can have tactical avoidance, which is what was done in 2010. Tactical avoidance and a political arrangement. But the dominant party has been the PNM across the board. And the PNM has functioned on the basis that it operates on the basis of a hegemonic single party that will not share power. Other parties, to become successful, have had to enter into some kind of power sharing arrangement so that voters who are not voting PNM may feel motivated to vote and will come out, but not have their votes split by the political arrangement. So those tactical arrangements are based more on the electoral rather than the constitutional arrangements. When they get into power, that is when the issue of the power sharing and the coalition style arrangements come under pressure to a large extent to stay together, because the individual agendas come out in terms of what parties want to accomplish. The PNM in opposition has been a very powerful force and has been able to regain power in the face of, by forcing splits in the coalition arrangements. The split in the NAR in the 86-91 period, and then you had some of the fractures in the People's Partnership in the 2010-2015 period. To a large extent can be credited also to a strong PNM opposition and the way that the PNM functioned in opposition. So that I think we have to look at the electoral system to address some of what you're talking about, and the constitutional system in terms of political behavior when in power. But I think the electorate has the capacity for the pendulum to swing. There are enough independent voters out there to make the difference in various constituencies, and it is not as tribal as many people want us to believe.
I agree with that. We have to go, Professor Ghany, because we're coming up to the news now. But this is a conversation that needs to continue. I think it is important. I mean, the question I would like to ask you now is whether you are hopeful about the future. But we've got to go. We've got to make way for the news now. And I want to thank you for coming on and so frontally addressing some of the issues, courageously too. And I hope that we'll be able to carry on with this on another occasion, perhaps closer to Republic Day in September. Okay?
Certainly.
Thank you. Then. Thank you very much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that conversation. with Professor Hamid Ghany. We move on now to the news with Andrew Chan, and this is Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and my name is Bhoe Tiwari. Thank you very much.